Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFAL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the fourth session of the Drones for Public Health, Safety, Risk, Humanitarian, and Emergency Management Speaker Series, presented in partnership with York University's Advanced Disaster and Emergency Rapid Response Lab and the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology's Center for Innovation and Research in Unmanned Systems. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Toronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, so I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. I would now like to introduce today's moderator, Michelle Arif. Michelle is a research staff and geospatial analyst at the Center of Innovation and Research in Unmanned Systems, CIRIS, at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. She holds a master's degree in disaster and emergency management from Royal Roads University, as well as an applied bachelor's in geographic information systems from SAIT, and an undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto. Her research interests focus on how climate change influences disaster patterns and how emerging technologies such as drones can aid in disaster mitigation efforts. Additionally, Michelle actively volunteers with the Canadian Red Cross, contributing to the emergency response team and personal disaster assistance programs. Michelle, thank you very much for moderating today's session and for your ongoing support throughout this series. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone that's here today, and thank you for taking the time to learn with us. I'm super excited to be kicking off the first session for 2025 for this webinar series with a very knowledgeable and experienced guest speaker talking about a very relevant topic. Before we dive in, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping notes. The chat box below is open for communal dialogue. Feel free to talk in there. If you have any burning questions, feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to save them for the end, we'll have a question period at the end too. So we've got a Q&A box and a communal box as well. Today's conversation focuses on one of the most vital yet complex aspects of drone operations, integrating remotely piloted aircraft systems, or better known as RPAS, into complex aviation operations. In recent years, wildfires such as those in LA and across Alberta have underscored the growing intensity and frequency of these disasters, driven in part by climate change. These fires not only devastate communities, but also stretch emergency response systems to their limits. In these high-pressure situations, drones have proven to be invaluable tools, offering real-time insights for mapping fire perimeters, assessing damages, and even aiding in evacuation efforts. However, as we've seen during the wildfire season in Alberta, the challenges of managing crowded spaces shared by drones, helicopters, and water bombers are immense. Ensuring the safe and effective integration of uncrewed aircraft with traditional aviation systems is critical to improving wildlife response while safeguarding both the ground team and air operations team. Today's discussion will delve into this crucial aspect of wildfire management and explore how RPAS can enhance the ability to respond to fires like we've witnessed in Alberta and in LA, where swift coordination action is essential to saving lives and minimizing damage. This brings me to our guest speaker for today, Philip Reid. Philip currently works with the Government of Alberta as a wildfire risk management specialist. He, along with his team in Alberta Wildfire, focus on integrating new technology and business practices into wildfire management for the province. With approximately 23 years of experience in emergency response activities, Phil focuses on aviation-related initiatives, including the development of Alberta's wildfire RPAS capabilities. In addition to his role in technology integration, Phil also serves as an air attack officer during wildfire incidents, where he coordinates air operations and actively manages the airspace over a wildfire. His experience in managing the complex interplay of crewed and uncrewed aircraft during emergency situations offers a unique and invaluable perspective, and that's what we'll be talking about today. He'll also touch on wildfire business and capability development in Alberta wildfire and management headquarters. With all that said, I'm delighted to introduce Philip Reid. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for that intro, and happy to be here to just kind of share some knowledge and honestly just start a bit of a discussion around the use of RPAS and emergency management activities and emergency response. When I was asked to do a talk today or be involved in these sessions, I took a little bit of time and thought about what exactly would be a valuable form of conversation in this space right now, and what's relevant. And I decided to deviate away from talking about the things that RPAS can do in a wildfire environment, and the things that sort of the capabilities of different RPAS aircraft, and focus more on what the industry is doing to try and adapt and change and kind of embrace this technology that isn't really a new technology anymore when you think about how long our pass has been around, and the capabilities of these aircraft have now. But it's still an emerging technology that needs that new technology development perspective when we look at how we're going to integrate it into what we do. So instead of talking about specific aircraft and how we specifically use some RPAS now, and what we do with the RPAS that we engage under contract, I thought it would be more interesting and more important to talk about what our future plans are, and how we want to truly embrace this technology going forward, and not just focus on capabilities and use cases for the aircraft within the organization, but talk about how we can seamlessly integrate this type of aircraft with the aircraft types that we currently use. And we'll touch on some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and honestly, just some of the exciting things that I think are probably going to come down the line when we look at what we can actually do with this form of technology in emergency management as a whole. And mostly for today and for this conversation, I'm going to focus on complex airspaces. So I've decided to use wildfire as an example. It's something that I have a lot of experience with and I can speak to, and I think it'll really give a sense of what those opportunities and challenges are with this type of integration in emergency response as a whole. Um, so yeah, like as was mentioned, feel free as I'm up here talking today, if I say anything that sparks a question, feel free to raise your hand, and then we can talk about it in a little bit more detail. And then also happy to answer questions at the end. I'll leave some time for that as well. Um, so when we're looking at how drones are being used in emergency management, and just a point here, I'm not going to have a lot of slides for this presentation. I do have some, but it's more for a visual reference when I go into how airspace is currently managed on wildfire incidents, and how that organization of complex airspace happens. So I'll use that as a visual aid here in a little bit. But when we look at drones in emergency management as a whole, something that's really interesting is um, there's a lot of different use cases across um, all of the different hazards that you can think of for emergency management. So, whether it's a wildfire, whether it's a flood, whether fire departments responding to a motor vehicle accident on the highway, I'm sure we can all think of things that we could use this type of technology and this type of aircraft for. So, there's a lot of excitement around it. There's a lot of people thinking about the capabilities and the advantages of using this aircraft type in ways that we haven't used it before, and being able to fill those gaps, and being able to see things that we haven't been able to see, and use this technology to sense things that we haven't really had that ability to do in the past. um, and I find it really interesting, some of the use cases um, that other organizations explain to me that they're using it for, like the scene reconstruction for motor vehicle accidents on the highway allows for a lot more you know, efficient process to actually gather that information, get highways open back up quicker, which reduces the risk of, you know, additional accidents happening, things like that. All the other uses for even just aerial survey of a scene when people are making command decisions and to inform decision makers and those aspects. I mean, those are some of the obvious ones when you think about it as well. Um, One thing that I've personally found interesting is that a lot of job postings that we're seeing in the emergency management field now are encompassing things like RPAS in them. There's been job postings that have come out this year for various municipalities in and around Alberta, which is where I'm from, um, that require some level of awareness of RPAS operations. Some of them require, you know, an advanced operator license. Some of them just require the desire and the ability to achieve some of those qualifications. So I think we're really starting to see that more of a formalized um, recognition of this tool and how valuable and important it can be, like in the line of work of emergency management, emergency response, those type of things. One of the things that comes along with that is as these programs expand and as different organizations like municipalities, fire departments, directors of emergency management, um, even you know, medical services for like triage and stuff like that when we're talking about like a mass casualty event, and they need to roll out a bunch of ambulances to that scene. There's a lot of people that are expanding and using this tool now. So um, the interesting thing is a lot of these organizations have not had experience in the past doing a lot of air operations. So it's not having an aircraft isn't something that some of these municipalities don't really have a lot of experience with. It introduces a challenge um, uh, into the industry when you zoom out and look at it with the systems thinking approach and saying, okay, now we have a bunch of um, I don't want to say smaller, but like more geographically concentrated jurisdictions. So, like when you think about a municipality versus a province, or a municipality versus a city, um, even though a city's still a municipality, like a rural municipality versus a city, and you look at the geographic scale that they're operating in, there's some unique challenges that form around that. But what this essentially is doing with these organizations purchasing RPAS and drone aircraft, they'll um, they're incorporating an aviation division into what they do. So aviation operations are now rapidly expanding across the country. Fire departments have their own aircraft, whether it's a helicopter or an RPAS. That fire department has an aircraft, and they're now engaging in aviation operations, and there's a complex system that has to integrate in with all of those different types of aircraft, whether it's a person flying a helicopter around, sitting in that aircraft and surveying the scene from above, or an RPAS operator controlling it from a remote station that they just drove up to the scene. So in my role with, excuse me, another thing I should have mentioned earlier was suffering from seasonal allergies right now as I'm traveling. So you'll probably see me take a few drinks as I talk here, and I'll probably cough a few times, which is kind of annoying. So I apologize in advance for that. But one of the things that I think um, that we're seeing a lot as this RPAS industry grows and expands is the need to interact between different organizations related to aviation operations that haven't necessarily had to talk about those things before. So being able to safely integrate everything that we're doing, I think we're at a critical stage right now in Canada. Um, when we look at the amount of fire departments that have drones, for example, and the amount of aircraft that wildfire entities use to respond to emergency scenes. In wildfire, we essentially use helicopters like a fire truck. We have a huge geographic scale, and we need to cover long distances in short amounts of time. So we station our people throughout the province in helicopters, the same as you would have a fire crew sitting at a fire station in a city or a municipality waiting to respond to something that happens. So I think, like I said before, this critical juncture, as everything's expanding at that municipal level and the more of a local level, it's important that we have conversations with everybody that we're going to interact with. All response agencies have mutual aid agreements with neighboring jurisdictions. An emergency response is cooperative in a lot of ways, where we'll need help with resources. We will go help partners out somewhere else if they need help as well. So we need to have those understandings and procedures in place before we actually get into that response environment where we need to adapt on the fly and we need to dynamically manage the situation in real time. So one of the things that I do in the summer months is I go operationally and fly with the water bomber groups in Alberta. We have 10 different groups of water bombers. We group our aircraft into group configuration, and consists of like one bird dog aircraft and either one heavy water bomber or multiple water bombers that are either skimmers or smaller aircrafts than our heavy water bombers in our fleet. The purpose of that bird dog aircraft is to fly someone like me out to the fire, to actually be there on site, managing that airspace dynamically in real time as the situation evolves. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint here in a minute. I'm just going to kind of go into how we typically manage that airspace in that scenario. And then I'm just going to run through how that works now. We'll touch a little bit on how drones can fit into that, but I'm more going to focus how we can fit drones into this dynamic airspace management environment once I go through how things are managed right now over a fire. So just bear with me for a second here. I'll share my screen. There. Okay, can you see this presentation all right?
Yeah, looks great.
Great. Okay, so yeah, we're just gonna talk about Wildfire as an example of complex air operations over an emergency incident. This is a diagram of what some of the rules are related to the airspace situation over a wildfire incident. So when a wildfire happens on the landscape anywhere in Canada, there's something that's called automatic flight restriction that comes into effect. So it puts an automatic Class F airspace over this wildfire, and it's essentially it's 300 feet above the ground and a 5-mile radius from the perimeter of the fire is a restricted airspace where only the jurisdiction with the authority to respond to that incident is allowed in that airspace, and anybody else has to be authorized in that airspace by that jurisdiction with authority. Which, when we talk about the use of drones in a few minutes, that's where things can get kind of complicated now, where we have so many different entities um, getting into aviation operations, and the different jurisdictions of authority are kind of an interesting angle to that as um, as we get more into these detailed airspace operations. So yeah, this is just the automatic flight restriction that comes into effect. So anytime there's a fire out on the landscape, it's restricted. Only fire people or authorized agencies are allowed to fly within there. So the way that we typically manage the airspace in this Class F environment um, is we keep separation. We keep the aircraft separated. So we keep the aircraft separated vertically and horizontally. So, for example, my job when I take off from an air tanker base somewhere in Alberta and I fly in a bird dog plane out to this incident that we've been dispatched to, and I have a tanker coming behind me. One of my initial concerns is deciding what altitude or what elevation the ground is, and then what altitudes I'm going to be putting aircraft in. It's my responsibility to ensure that we have separation between the aircraft, and we achieve that by a lot of radio communications, mirroring exactly how they do it within controlled airspace, within like a Class C or like a tower environment, if you're going to an airport. Some of this information is a surprise to some people, like trying to understand how this airspace is actually constructed over a fire. It's fairly a rigid structure, and it's modeled after an airport. So the best thing to think about is when you're going to a wildfire incident and flying into that airspace, it's really the same as going into a busy airport with a control tower where you have to talk to somebody about directions on what your dynamic movements are within that airspace zone. So typically the bird dog aircraft gets there first. We use that working airspace of from the ground level to 1,000 feet. When we're showing the tankers where we want them to drop, we're typically about 50 feet off the treetops, checking the run for safety. And that tanker is anywhere from 100 to 200 feet above the treetops when they actually do their drop. So in the bird dog, we fly down, check the run for safety, and then once the tanker's overhead, we show them where we want them to drop and fly the run for them. And then after that's done, it's all formation flying, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there's a lot of complex operations happening within a very tight space, which makes it really important that all aircraft within that zone are being dynamically controlled and are in communication with everybody else that's there. So as we have air tankers and other aircraft arriving, we'll stack those aircraft. So that, like I said before, that working altitude is from the ground level to 1,000 feet above the ground for the bird dog, and then we'll put the first tanker at 1,500 feet, and then 500-foot intervals above that. So 1,500 feet, 2,000, 2,500. And the rule of thumb is it would be nice if the ground level everywhere was a nice round number and it was, 1,500 or 3,000 feet above sea level, and we could do the math evenly, but we typically just round up to the next 500. So if I show up to a fire and the elevation of the ground is 800 feet above sea level, then we round that up to 1,000 feet above sea level. So that would make our working space for the bird dog that 800 to 2,000 feet, because we rounded up to 1,000, which would put that first tanker in at put them in at 2,500. So and then 500-foot intervals above that. As we have other aircraft coming in to do different operations, we stack them at those 500-foot intervals above everything that's going on. So if we have somebody coming in to just do an assessment or see, do an observation or reconnaissance flight over the fire, we'll usually put them quite high above everything. So typically around 1,000 feet above the top aircraft in the stack at that point, and then we'll bump people around as needed. If more aircraft come in, we might have to move people up. But we just kind of control that in real time as things happen. So then when you think about drones, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, and how we can fit all that into this category, it's really going to depend on what the mission is for that specific aircraft, what that aircraft's going to be utilized for the duration of this overhead of the fire, and what its capabilities are and where it should fit along with all the other aircraft there. Do we want to put that drone above everything else? Do we want to have it low, close to the ground, supporting crews, etc.? So that being said, a lot of helicopters that come into this environment when there's active tanker operations happening will use that ground level to 500 feet as like kind of a general rule of thumb. Those will be helicopters with buckets on them, and helicopters that are slinging equipment in and have external loads and things like that. So we'll never put an aircraft above another aircraft that has a detachable payload or the chance for anything to go wrong in that sense, where there's other aircraft below them that that could potentially create a really bad day. So that essentially sums up how we stack everything. And to go beyond this, which the next slide kind of goes into, is there's different types of formation flying. I'm not going to go over all of them because there's no point in us covering all that today, but this is just kind of to emphasize the amount of complex maneuvers that are happening in this very tight airspace. So this is modeled after an airport. So if a plane was coming to land at coming into land at an airport, they would be given a runway that they're going to land at, given a runway number, which tells them which direction they're going to be landing on that runway. If it was a north-south runway, then the number would be at the end of the runway where they're going to be landing, and they would fly over that on final. So these are typical plane circuits. We won't go into too much of that today, but if there's anybody else who's a plane nerd like me and wants to talk about that later, we absolutely can. But these aircraft, we fly in close quarters, like very close quarters. So we're less than a half mile away from each other quite often. So once we in the bird dog show the air tanker exactly where we want them to go, we then go into a formation flight where we can get into position behind them and assess the drop as the drop's coming out, and then give them a safe exit with them in sight, keeping everybody in sight, because it's all visual flight rules and visual flying that we're doing within that fire traffic area. So for a lot of our air tankers, like the ones that I just showed you in that formation slide, that where we did the offsetting circuits, those tankers are typically they're typically land-based aircraft, so they'll have to go back to an airport somewhere to reload. They'll reload with like a fire retardant slurry, and then they'll come back to the fire. And then when they come back, they'll call us, and we'll put them in at a position in the stack, and they'll just orbit above the fire in that position at that altitude in the stack, waiting for all the other tankers to run through. And then once they're the last ones or the next ones up, that's when we give them their clearances down to go do everything. This diagram here shows a different type of aircraft that we use, like a skimmer aircraft or a skimmer water bomber, where they'll go to a lake. They can actually skim along the top of the lake. They deploy scoops on the belly of the aircraft, and the scoops pick up about 1,500 gallons of water in roughly, I think it's 15 seconds. And then they just come off the lake and go back into the fire. These aircraft pose a specific challenge when we're talking about a lot of low-level operations. So if we have a lot of helicopters, or in the case of what we're talking about today, if we have a lot of RPAS or drones like who operating in certain areas, we need to be very aware of how we're moving these water bombers around the fire, where they're transiting to the lake, where they're transiting back from the lake, and what angle they're coming in at the fire and where they're dropping. And I'm sure a lot of us have heard about the incident that recently happened down in California, where Quebec CL 415 and a drone are suspected to have a collision, or I guess it's been confirmed now. But there's still a lot of details to come out with that. I mean, the investigation has to happen. There's lots of media reports on it. There's some conflicting information, but essentially that's a really high risk profile, that type of flight. When you're in an urban environment like that around LA, lots of looky-loos with drones, people with their own personal aircraft wanting to check out and see what's going on. And then these aircraft flying at a very low altitude, constantly coming into the fire. It's pretty rare for these aircraft to go higher than 1,000 feet above the ground, even when they're going to the lake or from the lake, just because there's not a lot of point in using that much power and that much fuel to climb to a lot of altitude just to have to dive back down. So the risk profile of using RPAS in and around certain parts of the fire where these aircraft are working is it's a high priority for direct coordination. So somebody in my role on a bird dog aircraft would want to know exactly where those RPAS are operating on the fire, so we can ensure that that operator is staying clear of the area that we need to work, and vice versa. If they're doing a high priority mission, we can divert around where they're working and not have a potential conflict like like the event that happened in California. Not saying that it was a wildfire drone that was being used there, but just that result is that's what we don't want to have. So sorry, this image is a little bit blurry, but this is an example of an air operations map that we use in wildfire management. So One of the ways that we've theorized about being able to manage this effectively is if we're going to be doing high value operations with RPAS, identifying exactly what grid squares those RPAS are going to be operating within this map. So you can see this, somebody who's never seen one of these fire maps before, the red line kind of outlines the perimeter of the fire itself. There's a bunch of other symbols on this map that I won't go into, but for the purpose of air operations, if we were requested to come out to an incident like this that is established and we have mapping products for, we can we typically get like a grid reference, go to this square, hit a target in this square. And then the way that we would manage our RPAS operations in and around where we're going to be working is it would be identified exactly what grid squares are flying in. If we have skimmer operations, we would keep clear of those grid squares. Or if we needed to move either one of the operations, either the tanker operations or the RPAS operations, this is how we would reference it, the different grid squares along the fire perimeter, and just basically keeping horizontal separation. If we don't need to be working in the same airspace, we're not going to introduce that conflict. So as we continue to develop our program and talk about what we want to do with RPAS and how we want to incorporate this into our work and what we're doing with Wildfire, we really want to come at it from a from a use case perspective, but also a mission-based approach. So what gaps are we filling in our current operations right now? What are we achieving from using this type of technology? And what are the considerations that we need to integrate everybody safely together and to do all those things at the same time in a safe manner? Not every single type of aircraft flight that we do right now currently with helicopters or with fixed wing can be replaced by RPAS right now in its current state. Maybe it shouldn't be altogether. That's something that we're trying to figure out. So as we're going through our development with our program, we need to do a lot of work related to what does add the most value with this aircraft type. The challenge with this is the industry, as everybody here knows, is very dynamic. What we could do 3-4 years ago is different than what we could do today. So as we go through development, it continues to be a snapshot in time. Like a lot of other aviation related initiatives, there's capabilities that we have now that we didn't have 4 or 5 years ago. Right now we have the ability to use helicopters at night with night vision goggles and carry crews, and they're equipped with belly tanks so we can actually suck water up from a water source and bomb on the fire at night. We didn't have that capability even 3-4 years ago. So all aspects of aviation continue to change. We just need to adapt and try and keep pace with that. So one of the objectives of like my group with the capability development and analysis program is we look at how can we what's our most bang for the buck? How can we effectively use this tool the best way? Currently, right now, we have contracts for hotspot detection on large incidents where we have contractors come out and use their aircraft and do hotspot detection at night, provide a mapping product for crews during the day that is given to them first thing in the morning, where they can go out and they can verify all these heat signatures that were found the night before. We're expanding into doing additional things where, we're dynamic and tactically doing that at the same time with an operator and with crews to actually like guide them onto spots to validate this in real time versus just using the night mapping products like to supplement that program. And then there's other things that we theorize that would be valuable in the sense of like nighttime firefighting with those night vision goggle equipped helicopters. Can we use some of these aircraft to actually target spots that we think are a priority being identified by somebody at a ground station, and then using a infrared laser on that RPAS to actually mark targets for that night vision capable helicopter that you can see through night vision and just fly to and hit the target that way, similar to how the military uses lasers to do target identification and things like that. The point of all this is um, we're still growing, we're still learning exactly what we can do to be most effective with this type of technology. The challenge for me is we need to do this in a way that we can repeat and defend it. So um, one of the things that I've done is I've actually worked with SATE a little bit to propose a project and a research partnership to formally look at how we can expand our use case development, to formally look at how we can rapidly advance or grow the way that we're integrating this type of technology uh, into our operations. And we're seeing it organically happen around the world with different wildfire organizations doing the same thing. Australia just released a roadmap for their RPAS program development in December of last year. And their timeline horizons kind of validate what a lot of us are thinking as far as like dealing with these complex problems. We're probably looking at a timeline of somewhere between that 6 to 10 years before we can have full integration of RPAS and crewed aircraft working together in a cohesive, normal, routine business kind of way. That's not to say that we're not going to do that beforehand, but right now, what we need to do is we need to continue the development research. We need to look at how we're using these aircraft. Like an example for the value of use cases is with the geographic scale that we're operating in the wildfire environment, it's going to be different than other aspects of emergency management. So an entity like a fire department or a police station using an RPAS to do investigations, to do like a scene reconstruction makes a lot of sense. They can keep that equipment with them in their vehicle. It's there when they need to use it and they launch it up. We run into some particular geographic challenges uh, when we want to use this type of technology in Alberta. Our jurisdiction is 650,000 square kilometers. So how do we have enough of this technology in the right places at the right times to be able to use it in a fully effective way? So that's where we're getting into that. Where's the value? Where are we going to get the most bang for the buck out of it? Some of it might be realistically with these very large fixed wing platforms that can cover long distances and be remotely piloted from a central location. But again, that specific type of technology will just be valuable in certain mission types, niche settings, and that's what we're attempting to do through our guided research development when we're doing these field activities that are proposed for the future. So these four elements are what we're really concerned about. Getting the most value, um, how can we actually complement what we're doing rather than just using a piece of technology for the sake of using a piece of technology? Um, how can we truly integrate everything safely? And when you consider the complexity of the airspace that I talked about over a wildfire incident, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to integrating any type of technology. Is a quadcopter setup going to be the most appropriate to do an overwatch type of position at 9,000 feet above everything that's going on? Likely not. That's likely not going to be the best use of that piece of technology. Could we do that with a large fixed wing platform that can stay in the air for 10 hours? Likely. If we have a platform that has a proven track record, airworthiness, um, and is a trusted machine that we are comfortable putting above crewed aircraft, then yeah, there's a real potential for that type of use case for that type of technology. And when is it appropriate to use crewed aircraft versus uncrewed aircraft? There's some stuff that we can do with RPAS and drones that um, we can't do with a helicopter. We can't do with a fixed wing plane. And an example of that would be Anybody here who has spent any time on the West Coast in the last couple of years can probably relate to the fact that we've had a lot of scenarios in the summer months where um, we have long periods of low visibility with smoke. So uh, we have a lot of fires on the go, a lot of smoke's getting put up in the air. There's times where it's not safe for us to fly uncrewed aircraft, where we can't launch a helicopter, we can't launch a plane to actually just go do a reconnaissance of something that we want to see. Maybe that's to check for, have we burned up to a trigger point where we want to recommend an evacuation with the community? Do we want to go do an assessment of damage or where the fire perimeter or the fire behavior is on a given day for a specific reason? There's an advantage of using RPAS in that type of environment where very low visibility, but we can just stay low and slow to the ground, and we're not putting people at risk by doing that flight. Not to mention, it's not, we're legally not allowed to fly in those conditions because we're flying under PFR rules. So it does open up some doors to some potential opportunity with this type of technology. We've done a few exercises where we've integrated RPAS with crewed aircraft, and um, it works. There's no reason that we can't do it. That being said, we just do need to be cautious. There are things that can go wrong. There's some hiccups, and I think everybody here can understand that as we're integrating an aircraft that has people on board with another aircraft that doesn't have people on board, these two aircraft need to operate in that same space effectively. So how do we actually find that middle ground of those two aircraft talking to each other and working with each other in a way that it enables both of them to do their mission and achieve valuable work that the other likely is specialized in doing. Um, so that's kind of the quick rundown on the integration of RPAS into a complex airspace. I'd be happy to take some time now and just answer any questions about anything that anybody has thought about related to how we can do this more effectively, or if there's any questions on the airspace management itself, what some of the challenges with drones are. There is a lot of things that I just kind of glossed over because we don't have a ton of time to go into airspace management, and that's usually a 2-day course in and of itself. So um, I think I will take a pause right there and just see if there's any questions from anybody.
Great, thank you so much. I'll wait to see if any questions pop up. Those were really great. It was a really good overview of the different processes that kind of go into. I know there's a lot of detail that was kind of glossed over, but it did give a really good overview. One question that I had was when you mentioned different emergency operations organizations kind of moving towards the same direction on their own pace, I guess. You mentioned Australia publishing something in December. What do you think Canada is doing? Like, where do you think Canada shines most, where other people are kind of looking at, like, this is a really good example? Is there an area that, Alberta does really well, or Canada in general does really well in emergency operations?
Yeah, I'd say we're pretty uniquely positioned. So we're in a good place in Canada to be able to do a lot of field trials with this type of technology, where a lot of other jurisdictions around the world aren't. So I'm a member of various groups and various committees and stuff dedicated to RPAS development, and talked with some counterparts in the Netherlands that have some challenges doing different types of trials just based on the pure population density over there. Similar issues in the United States and other parts of Europe. Australia has some advantages similar to ours, where like they have a lot of rural area in Australia where they can do some remote testing of aircraft, but no other no other jurisdiction has the same type of automatic flight restriction over a wildfire that we do in Canada. So that uniquely positions us in the world to be able to do some testing specifically in the emergency management realm because we have an automatic flight restriction over those incidents. Um, Other jurisdictions put restrictions in place, but it's not automatic. So an example would be down in LA and California and a lot of other areas of the states. if an incident happens, it's usually a race by news helicopters to get there to get some footage of it. And then the airspace is actively managed, and they do listen to the airspace managers and do altitude assignments and all that stuff, and leave the area if they're asked to. But we're uniquely positioned to be able to utilize or leverage that Class F automatic airspace that happens over wildfires to do testing. And we've talked with different researchers with NASA, out of the Ames Research Lab with NASA, and a couple other ones that are interested in coming up here and partnering in some of the stuff that we're doing, just because of those unique airspace advantages that we have here.
Interesting. Okay. You also mentioned, I guess, not difficulties, but there's a different way to kind of manage emergency operations in an urban versus a rural area. What kind of challenges do you think they're facing down in LA? If you don't mind speaking to that.
Yeah, I mean that whole LA example is pretty complicated. So a lot of the fires that are happening in and around, like I'd have to look at a map, but I believe the Palisades fire, as well as a couple of the other ones, are within LAX airspace. So like the airport itself, the airspace encroaches on where those fires are, and we have that situation happening in Alberta fairly frequently as well. But it does pose an additional challenge with airspace management. So you have an airspace manager for that Class C airspace, and then an airspace manager for the Class F, but those airspaces overlap. So who's in charge? Typically, you need to negotiate with that other controller. So like if I was overhead of a fire in Alberta and it encroached, say, over Fort McMurray's airspace, we would talk to that tower and we would figure out, like on the fly in real time, how to manage that. One of the things, like in the LA scenario, is like they do their airspace a little bit differently than we do our airspace here in Canada. So they are likely not stacking their aircraft. They are likely keeping their aircraft lower to the ground in like a racetrack type pattern. It's typically how they do it there. And this, in from the perspective of like integrating that aircraft type with RPAS, it does create a few challenges when you're talking about transiting an RPAS from one spot to another. Like a lot of overlapping flight lines and corridors and things like that are something that you really want to stay away from with this type of airspace management. You want to define, this aircraft needs to come in at this altitude. You need to stay at this altitude to maintain vertical separation. Don't go over there by this lake. Don't go over there by that building. That type of stuff. So all of the population density, the people with their own, personal drone aircraft that are like just illegally flying the aircraft around fire operations is definitely a challenge. And we're really in the early stages of like counter drone technology to be able to effectively manage the problem drone aircraft. And unfortunately, that's what always hits the news. Like we've probably all seen what happened with that Quebec Fort 15 down in LA, but I personally haven't seen any other reports about how they're effectively using drone aircraft on that fire, and I'm sure they are. The U.S. Forest Service has a really robust drone program, and from the people that I've talked to there, they do a really good job of like managing and balancing between using drones and crewed aircraft. So it's what hits the news is what we hear most of the time, and unfortunately, trying to manage that aspect of it as well. Drones tend to get some negative publicity when you're talking about response to emergency management. So that's something that myself and colleagues are trying to actively counteract.
No, I can understand how that's such a difficult situation to manage. I mean, in a densely populated area like LA, and everyone, most people, if they are doing some kind of photography or anything in that space of digital media, if they have a drone, it's like so enticing to put it up in the air, and that could be one of the most dangerous situations. And the pictures that we saw of the Quebec water bomber, like it looked pretty intense. I mean, they're very lucky that nobody got hurt. Nobody, yeah, that could have been very serious, but definitely scary
Yeah,
situation. Yeah.
and when you think about where that drone actually hit that plane, it hit it on the left wing, so created a bit of damage to the leading edge of the wing, but it's not very far from that impact point to where the windscreen is on like on that aircraft. So if that drone aircraft actually like blows out the front window and comes into the cockpit, it can be pretty bad as well. Um, it's just the last thing we want. Is any type of aircraft collision is an aircraft collision, whether it's two crewed aircraft colliding in midair, or an RPAS and a crewed aircraft colliding in midair. They're both really serious incidents. So I'm really curious to see the outcomes of the report that comes out of that one, because I think that'll help inform people like myself and others that are building policy around this to um, it's just another piece of the puzzle, is something else that'll aid us in making effective policy.
Definitely. And I do think policy and technology work hand in hand. And I know detect and avoid systems aren't on all drones as of yet, but maybe in the future that's something that'll be mandatory for some of these newer drones, especially if this happens more and more.
Yeah. And one of the other things as well that factors into all this is like the technology piece, being able to integrate these two aircraft types together effectively isn't limited to just like C2 systems, like whether the operator can dynamically control the aircraft or not. It comes down to also the hardware that's on the aircraft, because one of the fundamental pieces of information that we give any incoming aircraft into a fire traffic area is going to be, here's your altimeter setting, this is your altitude assignment, what are you looking to do? And that altimeter setting is key. There's been multiple incidents over the years where there's been either near misses or collisions in fire traffic areas related to wrong altimeter settings. So the need to be able to actually set a barometric pressure altitude on the aircraft is pretty critical to effective airspace management in that type of realm. And that's just one of those legacy things from where the RPAS industry has really come and really been built up based on the products that these aircraft can provide as like a tool for mapping and things like that, and really accurate GPS, like GPS altitudes, to be able to build like all the different products that they're building with these aircraft. But now, as we're using these things for more and more, some of those traditional aviation elements also need to be incorporated on like some of those mid-level, mid-range commercial drones that are integrating with other aircraft, just to be able to do those fundamentals of airmanship. So,
Yeah, good point, definitely. I'm still gonna monitor the Q&A, but if no one has questions, I've got tons. So we talked about urban spaces. If we flip the script and go into remote areas in Alberta, can you speak to some of the challenges that you have faced where accessibility and infrastructure can be limited? What kind of, I guess, early detection resources are allocated to like kind of handling these wildfires? Are there any, or is that something that's still being developed?
yeah, so I think like there's a bunch of different tools that are used for detection. We currently have a detection network in Alberta that is actually really, it performs really well. And we've done multiple assessments over the past really like 3 decades to continually look at new technology and like different ways that we can adapt and supplement our detection network. And sometimes this becomes a bit of a political question. Sometimes it becomes a little bit of clickbait in the media as well. But we have a really good tower network in Alberta that actually is pretty effective. We can supplement it with other pieces of technology. And I mean, we're actively looking at how we can continue to do that in an ongoing way. It also just comes back into that piece of, managing that investment, and also, utilizing the tools effectively. So things like using an RPAS to scan an area that had a lot of lightning activity, and using an RPAS to scan that area overnight is something that we're actively looking at how we can do that. We have some challenges with regulations and beyond visual line of sight rules that are going to be changing here in the near future. So I think that'll open up a little bit more to allow us to do a little bit more at a larger geographic scale. But when we're talking about like working close to urban areas and remote areas, some of the challenges that we have with access in those really remote areas is it's just a really long way to fly with an RPAS away from a road, and some of the stuff we can't drive to. So there could be some potential to fly some of these pieces of equipment out to an area either at night or before it gets dark, and then um, just operate them locally, go closer to the fire. But I would say, like, as far as a challenge with integrating our pass into our operations as a whole, like not even talking about the airspace piece right now, is actually road access to some of these places that we need. We need the operators to actually get into to get close enough to the target area that they want to fly. Because some of these fires that we have happen are just completely in the middle of nowhere, no roads around anywhere.
Yeah, I can imagine that being a really big challenge. Has the province looked into building more warehouses, just getting crews out there when it needs it, but having that equipment there in case it's ever needed, or is it just too remote, too far, too challenging to even upkeep some of that maintenance?
Well, we do have, so the province is broken down into 10 different regions. So 10 different forest areas is what they're called. And each one of those forest areas has their own warehouse on top of, there's a provincial warehouse in Edmonton. So we have warehouses kind of scattered throughout the province where we use, um, we have a bunch of firefighting equipment and all of our stuff kind of stockpiled there that's readily available to people that need to use it in the field. And then each of those 10 forest areas have usually two primary bases where they house fire crews and uh, quite a number, usually a dozen or more temporary day-based locations where they can send their crews during the day. So daily a planning activity happens where are we going to place our crews tomorrow, where are they going to be, so then they'll load up a helicopter with all their gear that they need and then go pre-position somewhere where there's higher fire hazard, especially if there's a risk of lightning or ignition of any sort in that area. So there's a pretty robust system to move resources around, the province. The challenge is when we get like an actual incident, and if we want to use a drone and we have a requirement to have like a ground station that's in a van or something like that, if that's what the operator is using, then sometimes that remote access can just really be a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think we're almost close to the end. I could ask you questions all day, but thank you so much for this presentation, and thank you for bringing light into so many of these topics that I'm sure we'll Google more about and learn on our own time. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let Francesco do the closing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to quickly echo thank you so much for that great session. It was a great way to start off 2025 sessions for this series. Um, yeah, and super interesting information. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and your thoughts, especially like Michelle said, with everything going on in LA. Um, I think yeah, it's a great time to be talking about this and really seeing how well, we were talking about this a little bit before we even started, but seeing how like these kinds of fires can still happen even outside of what would typically be a regular fire season. So, yeah, thank you so much for this. I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed the talk as well. Just a couple of quick reminders. This series is still ongoing, so we do have monthly sessions. Our next session will be February 20th, where Wade Hawkins from SAIT will actually be giving his presentation. Um, so please mark that on your calendars um, if you're interested in that session. Please also feel free to keep sharing this series information with your networks, as registration is always open and free until the very last session. And this session itself was also recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel for you to review. And if you'd also like to share that recording within your networks, please go ahead um, and feel free to do so as well. And with that, just one last big thank you to our partners at State. Thank you, Michelle, for moderating the session, and thank you, Phil, for taking the time to be with us and for that great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.